maybe you are already asking the deep and profound questions like, how ought I to live my life? Or what is the good life? Or what is life's purpose? Or which is the best way to be a human being? Now, I think all of us probably would have asked some form or another of these questions. And to get the answers, we often kind of look around us to look at the way people live, and we ask, should I be living that way? Okay. Now, some people we observe live for pleasure and excitement. Some others live for wealth and for power. Some others live for status and for recognition. Some people are very religious, but seem rather closed-minded in some other ways. So when we observe these, we often find that there are parts of these observations that resonate with us, but there are also parts that don't. So things are not always as clear as to what is the best way to live our lives. Am I right? Sometimes we get confused. And many people may even decide that they don't want to think about this because it's just too troublesome. Okay? Or we will just follow what everybody else is doing, or what my family tells me, or what society is doing. We will just follow it uncritically. You know, how everybody is living, and then we will decide, this is how I want to live my life. Then 20 years later, they might come to realize that perhaps they were wrong. Perhaps what society has modeled, or what maybe my family has told me about what is important in life, which is often based on consumer materialism and secularism, may not always be the best. At the age of 45 or 50, they might then start feeling empty. Oh, I spent my life seeking money, seeking pleasure, seeking status, climbing up the career ladder. But why am I so unfulfilled? Many people will then go through what is called the midlife crisis. Now, in the Gospels, Jesus tells us in John chapter 10, verse 10, as Edmund had read, I have come that you may have life, and life to the full. Now, being a Christian means choosing to live life to the full. Now, we all know that, but what exactly is living life to the full mean? And how do we achieve this? In today's session, I hope to open your minds to what the flourishing life is all about. And I hope to show you that this idea of the truly flourishing one, while it can be deeply rooted in the Gospels, but it is not just in Christianity that we find good ideas about the flourishing life. We also find it, in fact, in the best of the philosophical traditions of ancient Greece, and in many of the great spiritual traditions of the other religions. So let's get straight to it. What is the flourishing life? According to Aristotle, the famous ancient Greek philosopher who lived about 2,500 years ago, the flourishing life is a life that allows us to experience the highest form of happiness, achieved not all at once, but rather through the course of a whole lifetime. The flourishing life is the thoughtful choosing and obtaining of all things that are considered good, like health, wealth, knowledge, wisdom, friendship, love, justice, and things like that. That if you have this, that these leads to the perfection of human nature and to the enrichment of life. Now, Aristotle wanting the flourishing life often requires us to make choices, some of which may be very difficult, especially when it comes to choosing things that give the deepest meaning rather than just things that are superficial and that might give pleasure to the physical senses. Before I get a bit deeper into explaining the flourishing life, let me try to open your minds to a very important insight that to me is crucial in determining what the flourishing life is. Now, if any of you have gone to Greece and you have gone to Delphi at the Temple of Apollo, now at one of the entrances, you will come across a marble arch with the inscription, "No thise uton." Okay? What it simply means is, know thyself. Now, Socrates, who was Aristotle and Plato's mentor, said that the unexamined life was not worth living. In fact, he spent much of his life examining things that society had said were very important. And he came to realize that a lot of things that society says are important are actually not really important. For Socrates, knowing oneself at the deepest level was crucial. Now, I, for one, believe that one cannot really know how one ought to live one's life unless one knows who one is. In a similar way, one cannot, so one could argue that a person cannot really understand what the flourishing life is until one fully understands what is it to be a human being. And I hope that that's a question that many of you here have tried asking yourself. Now, in philosophy, there's a word called ontology. Now, ontology is a branch of philosophy that investigates the nature of being. Okay, what is the true nature of being? So, a bird, an insect, a fish, a rock. What is the true nature of an insect? How is it different from a bird or a fish? Now, of course, to make things short, one of the greatest ontological questions is, what is the nature of being human? Now, you might think that this is an easy question, but I assure you it is not. Why? Because there are many very intelligent people today in society, scientists, intellectuals, people with doctorates in the academic world, who actually believe that we are nothing more than a body, a material body, not unlike the animals. That the human person is essentially a physical, material entity made up of about 70 trillion cells, of which only 40 trillion belong to us. The rest of the other 30 trillion cells, believe it or not, are bacteria, microbes, parasites, foreign organisms, and most of which live on our skin and in our gastrointestinal tract. A little bit of trivia for you. Now, if that is the extent of what a person is, then what would be the purpose of life for such a physical, material being? They would say, well, look at the animal world. Life's purpose can be observed to simply be reduced to surviving, passing on our genes, enjoying life, and avoiding pain. So they would say, so similarly too, the purpose of our human lives is a very utilitarian one. Now, the term utilitarian was coined by the British philosophers Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mills, and later used by Thomas Hobbes, and in particular, David Hume to kind of create his whole philosophy of utilitarianism, which was a very secular philosophy. For them, we are here merely to survive, to pass on our genes, to maximize pleasure, and to avoid pain. Well, that would be the purpose of life, many would say. Now, if you were to ask them, well, what about self-sacrifice, altruism, generosity of spirit, radical kindness, and so forth? It is likely they would say, oh, well, if that makes you happy, then by all means, do it. But life is so short. Why bother? Let's just enjoy it as much as we can. Now, if you ask them, what about the soul? Wow, scary question for modern thinkers. For them, they would say, there is no such thing as a soul. Well, they might concede that what you say is a soul is merely consciousness, which is the result of neurochemical activity going on in your brain, neurochemical reactions, neural networks, synapses, dendrites connecting, resulting in mental activity like imagination, remembering, problem solving, and all of this geared for what? Maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain. And all this, they would say, is of course entirely dependent on the body. They would add that the moment the body dies, the brain dies 3 minutes later because it does not have oxygen and nutrients, unless your cause of death was the explosion of your brain. Mental activity, they would say, and consciousness then finishes or ends. And that would be the end of your soul. For them, there is no such thing as the afterlife. And I imagine that many of you would have had friends who actually believe that. Am I right? But what if they are wrong? What if the soul actually does exist? What if it continues after death? Now, if you were an atheist or a secularist, you might ask me the question, well, Gerard, where's the evidence for that? After all, we live in a modern world where evidence is required for everything. In answering that question, of course, I could quote to them what the Bible says, or what the Quran says, or what the Buddhist sutras say, or the Hindu Vedas and other scriptures of other religions say, but I won't, because many secularists don't believe in religion. And they believe that religion and religious texts were all just made up by fanatics to control your mind and take your money. And they're not entirely wrong either. But what if I told you that the evidence for the soul's existence over the last 50 years has come instead from the scientific community? That in the last 50 years, we have had much research in paranormal studies, near-death experience, the noetic sciences, out-of-body studies, past life hypnosis, and the sort. And these studies have not been conducted by religious folks whom you might say are biased in trying to prove the existence of the soul, but rather by men and women of science, who often started out their research trying to prove that the soul does not exist, but who after many years of research and looking at the irrefutable evidence of their scientific investigation, came to realize that there is actually a part of our consciousness that continues well after our bodies die. Wow. Now, if this is true, my friends, then the whole game plan changes, isn't it? Because then a whole lot of other thoughtful questions come into play. Like, where do I go to after I die? Does it matter how I live my life?